Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp, and today I have here with me Dr. Jerry Bergman. And we're going to talk a little bit about a series of books that he has written, starting with the book that he calls Slaughter of the Dissidents. Now, you're not talking about killing anybody.
No,
is that
no.
what you're
just slaughtering their life, their home, their worldview, etc. Just doing what they can to hurt people who reject the secular worldview.
And you rejected the secular worldview after dabbling in it for a number of years.
Right.
And you were buddies with all the atheists on campus, and but that didn't last all that long, did it?
No, because I became very disillusioned with the atheist lifestyle. The main problem I had was it just doesn't conform with the science. We were talking about biochemistry earlier, and one of my degrees is in biochemistry from medical school, and I taught biochemistry. And biochemistry really puts the nail hole into the atheist worldview, because there's no way that the molecular structure of our body could come by evolution. It was designed, clearly designed, it works very, very well, and therefore it says there is an intelligent creator. And it's just, to me it's obvious, but to many people, of course, it isn't. In fact, a number of atheists have said it's obvious that there's a creator, but there isn't. So therefore we must help people understand that it's an illusion. The idea that we were created, that there's evidence for creation, is an illusion. And therefore we have to help people demolish that illusion and accept the reality, and that is that all life appeared by chance, time, unforeseen occurrence, and in case of life, the accumulation of mutations.
Now, there are 4 books in this series. What are the names of these other books?
Well, one is Slaughter of the Dissidents, of course, and then I have the other one, which is Censoring the Dissidents, the Darwin Doubters, and the other one is Silencing the Darwin Doubters, and I have several others coming out, which I'm not sure the titles yet, but indeed, each book covers pretty much the same thing, and that is that in academia today and in society today, if you question the secular worldview, you end up in problems. After I went through my problems, then more and more people would email me, reach out to me, and said, I'm having the same problem that you have had. And therefore I realized that my problem is not unique at all, that many other people have the same problem. And I talk in detail about why they have these problems, why the secular community is so aggressive against the community of people who accept the theological, the God worldview, and how to avoid this. And one way of avoiding this problem is stay in the closet. If you want to survive in a secular academic situation, you have to pretty much stay in the closet. And that's hard to do when you believe what you, the theological worldview, and you want to talk about it. But on the other hand, if you want to survive, you have to do that. Now that is primarily in academia. If you're a creationist and work in computer science, or work in some technology area, or work in some lab doing some research in some area, you're probably okay. The main problem is in academia, partially because in academia they're concerned about what you believe, because they want to know what you're teaching students. And if you don't accept the evolutionary worldview, they recognize that you probably are not going to enthusiastically present that worldview in your classes, and therefore they're not very supportive of you. Whereas if you work as a computer scientist, they don't care what worldview you have. They don't care if you believe we came from Mars. As long as you do your programming, as long as it works, as long as you're doing your job, we're happy. We don't care what you personally believe. In academia, they care very much about what you believe, because you can influence students, and they don't want that to happen. They want students to be indoctrinated into the evolutionary paradigm, which basically is summarized in the cliche, you probably heard this before, from the goo to you by way of the zoo. And that basically is a quick, poetic way of describing evolution. We start out as goo, we end up with becoming rabbits and primates and humans. So he went through the zoo, started out from the goo, through the zoo, and became human. So that is their explanation of where we came from. And of course, there's just no evidence against that worldview. They've looked for
Speaking
100.
about the brown sticky goo that I got when I was doing my experiments, one of the things that is interesting is that if you're going to take and create a nucleotide in the laboratory, and you have all these reagents that you're going to put together to mix together to produce the nucleotide, then what you would then if you take all the reagents and the things that you're going to mix together produce a amino acid. Well, if you have all of them together, they conflict with each other, and you don't get the results that you expect, you know.
Right.
And so it's a dilemma of chemistry that really made me make the choice that I needed to have a theistic worldview rather than an evolutionary worldview, because it was the chemistry just was telling me a different story than what I was being taught in the ideology of evolution.
Yeah.
Now, it's the ideology of evolution that really drives what you're experiencing in the academic world.
Right.
And I think that's what you experienced at the different universities that you taught at.
That's true. And it really is an indoctrination. You're really indoctrinated into the evolutionary worldview. And that's why they're so concerned, like my book on censoring the Darwin doubters. That's why they're so concerned that the other side doesn't get through. Because I think they realize that if you present the other side, people will realize that evolution is impossible. And if you think about it, as I study it more and more, my conclusion is the evidence for evolution is really absolutely pathetic. Simply do not have the evidence we need. And I'll give you a good example. When I talk about this to churches, they ask, what evidence do they have to prove we evolved from apes? Well, we've got 5 fingers. Apes have 5 fingers. Therefore, we're similar to apes. Therefore, that proves we evolved from apes. And they think about that and they say, that's ridiculous. Just because we have 5 fingers doesn't prove that we evolved from apes. Well, that's true. But on the other hand, that is one of the many evidences that evolutionists use to convince readers that we indeed evolved from apes. Sure, there are many similarities, but the similarities are in many ways doesn't prove anything. You know?
Yeah, it's like taking your silverware out of your drawer and lining them up to show that forks evolved from spoons.
Yeah.
You know, you have a spoon here, a spork here, and a fork.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's kind of but it's the wrong kind of logic to the argument from homology, which is what you're talking about, is really a very, very weak argument. You can argue that bats and birds and flying fish and flying reptiles all have a common origin, but they really don't. Even according to evolutionists, they don't. But they have all these similar flying creatures. So insects, bats, birds, and all these different creatures that have flight as part of their features. It doesn't, you have to be evolved for 5 different times.
Yeah. And that's the problem with the eye. We have the eye is so different, and there's no evidence it evolved, so they say the eye evolved. Some people say 32 times. And it's unbelievable it could evolve once. How can it evolve 32 times? Well, the reason they postulate that is because there's no way that the one type of eye could evolve into another type of eye. The eye that we have, the camera eye, there's no way that could evolve from the eye that you see in insects. They're so different, and they can't imagine how they could. So they say, well, insect eyes evolved totally from way back, and human eyes evolved totally from way back. So they evolved separately. So that doesn't only not explain how they evolved, but it creates a more of a problem for evolution. And that's, again, one of the many reasons why I felt just it couldn't, the science doesn't support it.
Well, science seems to think that if you describe something and give it a name, like convergent evolution, it means that you're actually explaining it.
And that's what they're claiming. It's convergent evolution. We started out with no eye, and we evolved to be similar as time went on, and that's evolution converged. But the eye in insects evolved very differently from the eye in humans, the camera eye.
And so it really makes more sense that you have a creator, creator God, who is like a computer programmer. He has certain objects of code that he has put together in the genome that he used when he did his creation, that he borrowed this piece here, he borrowed this piece here, and so the duck-bill platypus, okay, it has the piece from the duck, it has the piece from the reptiles, a piece from the mammals, and the piece from the birds, you know, that lays the eggs. It's a creature that looks like a mismatch of all kinds of different parts, and yet if you take a look at it from a computer programmer standpoint, which is what I did for a living, you just take pieces of code here and here and here and here and put together into this creature as you're creating it, all these different features that you know work.
Yeah.
And so when God did this creation, he did it with that type of intelligence. And you can't really explain it any other way.
Right. And they have no idea where the duck-billed platypus came from. Did it evolve from a bird, a mammal? What? Have no idea. But they say, well, we'll figure it out.
Well, yeah, the closest creature, there's only one other egg-laying creature in the world, the echidna.
Echidna, yeah.
And that's totally different. It's a spiny anteater.
Yeah.
And but it also lays eggs. I guess there's about 4 or 5 different varieties of that.
Yeah.
But there's the duck-billed platypus, which is totally different.
And this is what frustrates a lot of us, and that is that we're going by the evidence. We're looking at the evidence, and that's where our belief comes from, the evidence. Where evolutionists are not looking at the evidence. They're looking at their presumption that indeed we evolved, and therefore they're looking for evidence for it. And that's the major problem. You talk about the duck-billed platypus. Well, they're monotremes. Why do they put them in the monotreme category? Well, they had no category that they didn't fit in the mammals, the birds, amphibians, and so on. So they created a whole new category, the monotreme category, because it didn't fit anywhere else. So they're admitting the problem that they have with evolution. If it evolved, we must be able to figure out where it evolved from. Well, they can't. So we'll just create a whole new family, the monotreme family, for the duck-billed platypus. And they've done that for several categories. And so that's a good example of we just have to follow the evidence. Especially with the COVID virus in the past few years, we've had so much talk about following the evidence. And those who said we need to follow the evidence themselves often did not follow the evidence. And therefore, yes, let's follow the evidence and let's go where the evidence leads. And in this case, it doesn't lead to atheism or abiogenesis. It leads, of course, to an intelligent designer. And that's pretty obvious to many of us. And that's how they end up in trouble. It's amazing the similarities when I did the research. By the way, I had about 200 different cases of professors who were denied tenure or who were fired, some openly fired because of their refusal to support the evolutionary worldview, or their teaching information which evolutionists felt does not help support the evolutionary worldview. And this is what happened to all these people. And it's tragic in many ways. We need to get a good court case. We need to help the courts understand that we have a problem and let's fight this problem. And unfortunately, they're not. Partially, they're not because the judges, many of the juries, the common people, the lawyers, academia, they all hold to the evolutionary worldview. And therefore, we just don't have enough support, people who look at the evidence to support our side of this issue. And that's tragic.
That is tragic.
We need to stand up and we need to get into court and get some cases in our favor. Because we've got the evidence. We just have to present it effectively in court. And in the past, we haven't done that very well at all.
No, I remember the Kitzmiller versus Dover decision, and there was another one in the early 80s where they ruled against teaching creation in the classroom, or in the last case it was intelligent design. They didn't even want to discuss the idea that there's an intelligent designer. And but I sort of asked these folks, if you believe that you evolved, you also believe that your brain evolved. Well, if your brain evolved, how can you know anything about anything?
For sure, yeah.
Because what you're saying is random chance mutations and jumbled up arrangements of proteins and DNA resulted in your thinking.
Yeah.
And
evolutionists will say, "Hey, we'll figure it out. Just give us time. We'll figure it out.
Yeah.
We'll answer these questions. Just don't raise doubts. Where's your faith, brother?" That's what they'll, not in those words, but that's basically what they're saying. Where's your faith?
I remember going to the Michigan State University Library, pulling out a big book about this thick, and it was all about the problem of left-handed and right-handed amino acids.
Oh, yeah.
It was a symposium.
Chirality, yeah.
It was a symposium on that particular topic of trying to exploit subtle differences between the two different isomers of amino acids that are left-handed and right-handed. And this is a problem because life only uses the left-handed variety of amino acids.
Proteins, yeah.
And so, in proteins, and so if you create these in the test tube, they come out equal mixtures of both, and you can't separate them. Yeah. And it's just a big problem. And so this symposium, I was reading through some of this, and all their frustration in trying to find some way to explain this. And the conclusion, all this was research here, they just didn't have anything.
Yeah.
And so it's
interesting when you mentioned the Michigan State University Library. A friend of mine gave a complete set of my books to Michigan State University, and we found they would not put them in the general collection. They would put them only in the collection with witchcraft and other things. And so I thought, this is a royal insult, but this way they can reduce the effect, and my books are all purely based on the literature, the research.
Yeah.
So none of them talk about theology, none of them talk directly about theology. They're not religious books, they're not Christian books, but they're books which talk about the science supporting the theistic and non-secular worldview. And so why would they put them in the library part with witches and related? So now...
So they classify it as paranormal.
Paranormal, yeah.
And that's what it is that they're putting it in with all this Fuji-Wuji UFO supernatural stuff that comes out. That's basically the religion of today, You have religion of fantasy and the occult. And, that's acceptable, You can be as crazy as you want. And in terms of your beliefs. But if you're going to be scientific, well, you can, those things are okay, but to actually focus in on the Christian worldview, now that really raises some hackles. And I'm, fortunately, there are people I've associated with and been able to work with that actually have helped me in my search for this. And so I've really appreciated the people who I've come to know in the Creation Research Society and a few other places. And if you want a good perspective on that, go down to the Creation Museum in the Cincinnati area and learn a little bit about what that point of view is.
When you talk about evolution as religion, Michael Roos wrote an excellent, he's an evolutionist, aggressive evolutionist, and he wrote an excellent book called Evolution as Religion. And this published by Harvard, I believe, and it's 300 and some odd pages showing indeed that evolution is clearly a religion. It's a religious worldview. And you might not want to use the word religion, but worldview is better. So we have the evolutionary worldview and we have the Christian worldview. So they're worldviews. And what they do in the schools is they say, well, you're teaching against evolution. Therefore, you're teaching religion. And therefore, you can't do this. But in fact, evolution and creation are both religions or worldviews. And therefore, they're not saying you can't teach against one or for the other. They're saying you basically, one is a worldview and the other, evolution, is not a worldview, which is not true. Evolution is a worldview. It talks about where we came from, why we're here, and where we're going. The Christian worldview talks about where we came from, why we're here, and where we're going. And therefore, they're all both Christian and atheism and evolution are all worldviews.
Now, your 3 books, 4 books, depending on what it is, explain the differences between the books that you wrote.
Well, I focus, the first one is general. It talks a lot of case histories. The one, Censorship, of course, talks specifically about censoring. And silencing, the Darwin worldview, talks about how you silence. And you silence basically by censoring, by saying, okay, you can teach science, but you cannot teach anything about this area or anything about some other area. And so there are ways of silencing without directly necessarily firing people, although many, again, lost their job. So basically, they're all about how do we stop information against the evolutionary worldview from being presented in the schools. And they talk about the different ways. Censoring, openly censoring, of course, is one way. And then silencing is another way. And then, of course, a lot of the Darwin Dissidents is a kind of a general way which talks about both areas. So they cover the same topic, but different aspects of the same topic.
Yeah, we're experiencing a little bit more of that in politics.
Yeah, well,
you can really see that in a lot of areas in society. If you don't like what somebody else believes or thinks, well, there's ways of putting some pressure on that person to be a little bit silent, and that dismays me, of course.
Yeah. Unfortunately, many individuals, not only evolutionists but others, feel your idea is wrong and therefore I don't want it presented because you may convince some people of the truth of your idea. I don't want that to be convinced, and therefore censor. So many people condemn censoring, but so many people censor. Probably just the COVID virus we've seen is one of the best examples where treatments that doctors tell me work, patients tell me work, have been censored. You can't use it, and you can't present any information in favor of these treatments. Like Ivermectin, of course, the most famous example, which we have, 80 years of experience with Ivermectin, and I've never tried it, but I've had a number of people who said they did and never had any problems, and therefore they never got COVID. They feel it's because of Ivermectin. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But at least we need to have a good study that shows, does Ivermectin work? A good scientific study, and then we can answer the question by evidence and not censor. And that, I have a hard time with censorship.
Yeah, a lot of that is sort of like the fellow who is out in the street honking his horn to scare away the elephants.
Yeah.
And see how well it works,
Yeah,
you know.
it works really well. Yeah.
And part of it is that when you do an experiment, it's hard to actually put it in a double-blind test so that you can actually know that the results that you're getting are consistent and work, because a lot of it is dependent upon your perspective of what you start with in the assumptions.
I was told in Africa, many of the missionaries did not come down with COVID because they routinely use ivermectin to deal with, in those countries, to deal with certain virus and other problems. And therefore they already take it, and therefore they rarely, I'm told, rarely got COVID. Now we need to do the research, and I understand they've done the research, and what they found is ivermectin indeed is significantly helpful in dealing with the virus.
Well, that's amazing. And then, we have a lot of other cures that have been promoted by the government, and we wonder about them,
Yeah.
And so
I know of doctors who were kicked out of their medical profession, who were let go, who were at least disciplined because they recommended ivermectin for their patients.
Mm-hmm.
And that's tragic. So we need truth in evolution creation issue. We need truth in medicine. We need truth, period, in society. And unfortunately, we can see what happens when we don't have that. And I think that's why the rates of death from COVID varied so greatly according to countries. In Africa, I was told they're much lower than in many countries. And I was told it's because they use the ivermectin as a solution. Now, I'm not advocating that, but I'm saying I know many people who swear on 13 Bibles that indeed that helped them escape the COVID virus. We need at least to do the research to see which is more effective.
Now, if you're going to be volunteer to be the control group,
I want to be in the experimental group. No, I don't want to get the placebo. No, I want to get the...
that's the trouble with that, is how do you actually set up a good test for something like that? That's the trouble with a lot of scientific experiments, is to actually make it possible to test something consistently.
But you compare those who took ivermectin, period,
Yeah.
those who took both, and those who got the shots. And I know many people, frankly, I'm aware of many people that took ivermectin, that's all. They would not get the shots, period. And they took ivermectin, and most of them that I know of, and again, I don't have a sample of thousands of people, but among the ones that I know, maybe 14, 15 people, none of them got COVID, and none of them died who took ivermectin. So can't go on what 14 or 15 people did. We need to have a larger sample, and that's what they should have done. We need to do the research so we know what works.
But getting back to the three books you have, they're Slaughter of the Dissidents, they're Censoring, the Darwin Skeptics, and Silencing the Darwin Skeptics.
And they're all on Amazon, they're all on Goodreads, they're all on Barnes & Noble, even Kmart. And Walmart carries them, but not in the stores. Walmart, you can order them online.
Yeah.
So if you like to shop at Walmart, you can order all my books online.
Well, that's good. I've read all of your books. I have to admit that it takes some time to get through them all because you have so many cases. But they are excellent books to give you an idea of what you might expect in terms of personal persecution that you might experience when you're in the academic world or in on the job or anything like that. And so it's a difficulty that you have to learn how to overcome and learn how to take care of on your own. It's probably not a good idea to try to convert your professor.
That probably won't work. Although I know some professors that have been converted by their students.
Yeah.
So you got to, I guess.
Dean Kenyon was
Dean
one.
Kenyon was one. So
it's pretty amazing to understand that there are people out in the world who are so dead set against the Christian worldview that they take these kind of measures to prevent others to hear about it.
Yeah, and that's much of the problem.
Well, we'll see you next time on Revolution Against Evolution. We hope you enjoyed our show.